I think when you frame the idea, I'm gonna put 3 minutes because I can already feel it. 2 minutes is a little short, but one of the things I'll just say real quickly here is that when we're looking at how holistic resistance is different. Before Adrienne Maree Brown, I thought we were really unique, and I'm so glad that upon her work, I was like, oh, we're not alone. But before Adrienne Maree Brown and Emerging Strategies and all the brilliance that her and her crew brings, I felt really unique. But one of the things that we found is that by this kind of the nature of the work, that typical activism work is led by trauma. It's led by trauma. The trauma typically dictates the where we go, where we interrupt, and what we try and do. And that's not so that we've erased trauma. But one thing I think holistic resistance has really grounded in is, particularly if you look at this, the spectrum of like sex education for parents, white and black, and we'll even focus on the white parents. And then we'll look at like natural building and workshops for people that may or may not be parents. Like, how are these even connected, right? And when I look at holistic resistance, is we realized that quickly, when we looked at how we were oppressed, we're like, well, we can't just say we're oppressed around our economics, or just around our medical situation, just around our parenting, or just around acquiring resources. We realized everywhere we looked, we saw the hand of oppression pushing down. Maybe harder and more effective in other areas, but it was still very present and not hard to find. And so, of course, the name holistic resistance speaks to pushing back collectively. And so we no longer waited until it was appropriate to march. We no longer waited until we thought it was appropriate to teach children something. We realized that we wanted to start that right now, as often, and resist at every level. Resist when you have $5 and resist when you have 5 million. But both resistance are important, as long as we're pushing in the right direction. And so for me, I think holistic resistance is unique in the sense that our desire is to try to get ahead of the trauma story enough that what guides us is not just trauma. That might inform some actions. What guides us is, I'll call it tools. To really oversimplify it a little bit, I'll call it tools is what guides us. So we try to guide ourselves by the tools, informed and very aware of trauma. We're not here to exit and be like, there is no trauma. We're aware it's there. We don't want that to be the guiding machine. What we found so far is when we let tools guide us, we have been able to not grieve at the pace of media. So you'll know that with a mass shooting, 50 people will die, and the media will cover it intensely, wall to wall for 2 days, and then they'll move on. Or George Floyd will be executed on national television, and there'll be marches and intensity for like 3 months. And you'll see the country collectively can't handle that fever pace. Will collectively kind of settle down. Outside of Portland, everyone else kind of stuck to stuff down a little bit. Now the trial's coming, so now we're back at it, And so there's a way in which we want to appreciate those flashpoints. We want to honor. We really want to honor. That's my 3 minutes. But I'll finish here. I want to honor that we are going to resist. We are going to resist at a consistent pace. As the media gets loud and quiet, we're still here. Hey, think about this. As Trump goes out of office and Biden comes into office, we're still right here. As whatever it is, we still don't notice, and that's what we talk about our deep reaches. Oftentimes, when we say that, people go, "You're gonna reach for 10 years?" Like, I say minimum 10 years. Minimum. That's the minimum. If we're serious about taking someone's story and shifting, it's not an after-school program 30 minutes a day for a couple of months and we're good. There's impact there, but true shift, true growth is like a parenting, right? It's not something we do for fun. It's something we do for a lifetime. I don't know any parent that's really serious about parenting that goes, I'm just going to parent for about 10 years and then I'm going to relax and hopefully that's enough momentum to get from 11 years old to 50. They'll be able to be okay. I've seen parents in their 80s, their children in their 60s going, honey, this is what you got. I'm with you here. I'm fighting for you here. Even though you're changing my diaper, child, I'm still giving you magic. I'm still reaching for you. I'm still trying to figure, because forever they're parenting, right? They're forever investing in those parents that are in that marathon. And so even though I'm closing out my 30s and mom's in her 70s, and I've grown a lot, she's still tracking the brother. She still say, hey, how can I give you, even if it's subtle, I'm giving you wisdom. So for me, we take that same model, and as we're trying to support holistic resisting, we're trying to recognize that this is a tools-led space that I have found has given space for what the outside looking in might say is radical, right? Mm-hmm. But I think inside it feels like this is how we get oxygen. working on these topics is how we breathe. So even though it might feel a little radical right now, as folks looking in, I think those are inside realizing that this should be a normal conversation. It shouldn't feel too shocking to the system to acknowledge that the lynching narrative in America and its influences the sexual framework of America, which also influences how we should raise and teach our children. This shouldn't feel radical. It should feel normal because of how things have been set up in our nation culture. It does feel more radical, but that's why I think holistic resistance becomes a little bit ahead of the curve when it comes to how we are choosing to make each step forward is not dictated by just the gunshots, but we're really dictated by our choice to make the gunshots go away. And we know that's going to happen over time. That's going to happen in deep connection. And so we found that if we could take a little pill like they did in the Matrix and we could fix this and see it, we could. But right now we see the pill is basically deep relationships. That's where the revolution typically opens our eyes and minds up. So that's, I think, where we oftentimes step away from maybe the bigger landscape of activism that we see, and at the same time we step in sync with them as much as we can, and supporting them any way an opportunity arises where it makes sense for us to drop in with them. So that's what I would say, the framework I'm sitting with right now with our best thinking here in March 2021, which is a privilege to make it this far.
Yeah, I hear Aaron Johnson's mantra, get ahead of, right? Get ahead of the trauma, get ahead of the media, get ahead of the default, get ahead of, and that means we don't leave any part out.
Yeah.
Like I can't get ahead of my relationships if I'm not bringing my attention to my sexuality and to my gender and to my gender material and to my class material. Like I can't actually get ahead of my trauma if I don't have the courage to be aware of those and to sit with you and to sit with other folks in their awareness of that, which is what I love about both the edginess and the tenderness of this work.
It's well said.
Yeah, and do you want to just keep riffing for a little bit? Is this feel good?
Yeah, I love your mind. I would love to keep riffing with you. That'd be great.
So this brings me back to one thing we've been talking about, going beyond the giggle. Particular intersection of sexuality and anti-racism, and we'll just say for parents to step into their own discomfort of their own positionality around sexuality and racism, that's usually met with this like, oh, let me break the tension, like, oh, he said penis, oh my gosh. And I think of my mom, who was a 6th grade teacher for 29 years, and she led the sexual health and flash curriculum. And the first day of class, she would just say, we're going to get it over with. Penis, 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 vagina, vagina, vagina. And like, okay, it's 12-year-olds, right? She's trying to induce that giggle to get the tension out. But as grown-ups, that's still there. And I'll say, for my demographic, for white parents, for white grown-ups, absolutely that's still there. And so where in the work that we're so excited about, like, where is there a place for that giggle? Where is there a place for that tension? And what's the intention of transforming that through the relationship building of this particular process? That was a lot of questions, so
yeah.
whatever's alive.
Well, two things come up quickly when it comes to sexuality, and I appreciate when someone says I'm over sexuality. That's what I teach, and I think we need teachers that intensely teach about sexuality and notice that. But sexuality is such a backdrop of everything. Literally none of us would be here if it wasn't for sexuality. Look at like cockroaches and rats, which are going to be with us longer than probably humans will survive on the planet. And one of the things they have really figured out is their reproduction is so efficient, and they're able to reproduce their young and do it in a way that, with all the poisons and all the traps, we can never eradicate rats and cockroaches from our population. So in that, I as much as they really scare me at times, I really respect the cockroach. I really respect the rat. I think sexuality, to kind of pivot from these two topics to sexuality, but I'll explain, because sexuality is a part of the rat narrative and the cockroach. And as humans, we're so much more evolved than the rat and the cockroach. And maybe we could discuss that at some point. But there's a part, I was standing, there's a little slight bunny trail. I was in a corporate office somewhere. I can't remember what the office was. And it was a little cartoon in the work at the like little lunchroom, and there's maybe a cartoon character of a guy like holding the other guy by his neck, like strangling him, like shaking him in the cartoon, and the caption says, "What do you mean safety is not your department?" Right? And he's shaking this other guy, and what he's saying basically is like safety is everyone's department. Like everyone on this work site is responsible for safety, because if you are HR and you fall and break your ankle, it's a big thing. If you're a person that's on a drill rig and you're drilling and you kill someone, safety is critical everywhere. And I think if I could use that crude cartoon and just kind of say, people say, well, I'm going to leave that over to the sex educators. That's their department. Like, what do you mean? That's everyone's department in some way. And I think that's a way we all can really be teachers of sexuality, teachers of noticing it, having space for it. And I think that's one thing we are really good at in the United States. We have our sex films and our entertainment films. And I understand that some films are age appropriate for that group, but there's a way in which sexuality has a way it weaves into all of our lives, our parenting, our activism, in a way that I hope that we could be a little more seamless, which also addresses that first piece you just really named, is that going beyond the giggle. That giggle piece is partly because as a group, either eighth grader or 35-year-old, is that we don't quite admit how much is there. And so when it's named, the giggle is kind of an acknowledgement of like, there's some tension here. There's some, this is important. Now, I say that because I look at like sexuality, like those things like water, air, earth, sexuality. So when we talk about water, if we get too deep, people are like, yeah, water's a big deal. We realize how clean water's a big deal. The cares from the environment gets serious, but the average person in America particularly, they just turn on their tap and they just go, shh. They don't throw anything, they'll drink some of it, they'll throw it away, they'll poop in it, they'll pee in it. It's like, so we do. I grew up peeing in water. And anywhere outside of these super countries like America and Canada and several others where we poop and pee in our own water and just flush it and don't think about it, this is really strange behavior to the rest of the world. I mean, the majority of the rest of the world is like, you have clean water and you literally pee in it, a half a cup, and you poop in it, and then you take 6 gallons and wash that away multiple times a day, collectively. And we walk X amount of hours or X amount of, and we get a gallon of clean water that we can drink as fresh water. And we don't even notice it because of the inflation we're in America, it gets this. I feel like sexuality is that topic of, once we get mature about it, we can giggle, but we can stay with that giggle until it passes. And then we can get really sober about the magnitude of what it means to really notice each other in really deep investigations. I like to travel with questions. That's how I do it, but people might do it differently. And ask questions that wouldn't be asked if we stop at the giggle, if we stop at the convenience. But when we go past that, we start asking much different questions that on the surface might feel like unfair, right? I always say unfair questions start to come up. But these questions, I think, have become really critical in helping us go, I can see you. I can actually get the core solution of dismantling the system that's been plaguing our community, or plaguing our family lineage, or plaguing our country or region for 100 years. We can start getting to the core of what's there, not just making like jail cells for people, but really trying to figure out, what if we didn't need the jail cells? What would that mean? And I know a lot of people ask those questions now, but during the 90s, you would never ask, can we abolish prison? I mean, they were there asking the question, but no one was listening. Now they're like, hey, let's do that. Those kind of questions get asked when we get past that convenient point or past the giggle. And so I think for me, that's what I really try and sit with the chronic and untouched, and with educating ourselves around our sexual selves, that bring that tension up and then release it. And we get really sober, if I can use the word sober again, to listen to each other and go, what's here and what's possible now?
Something that really struck me when you said unfair questions, and I can relate to this as a white person specifically, in the sense of, I know when I first encountered you and encountered holistic resistance, you asked these amazing questions like, what is your ideal Black person? Mm-hmm. And some parts of me just went like a sheet. We're just like, that's an impossible question. Like, how could you even, that is an unfair question. And my nervous system doesn't know what to do with that. And when we're talking about like inviting people to deeply know their own sexuality and to see the way they see the world through their sexuality, through their curated narrative of sexuality, which is a whole different conversation. I think there's this willingness that we're inviting people into through the embodied conversation of, when you hear that question, what happens? Mm-hmm. Like, what's actually happening for you when you think about where you get uncomfortable around sexuality? As a parent, when you slow down, my kid asks me this question and I just tell them no. Mm-hmm. Or I say, go talk to your teacher. Mm-hmm. Or I say, that's an inappropriate question. Like, what really happens in me when I get uncomfortable around my own sexuality and around the sexuality of other people I don't understand? So slowing down that sense of like the unfair question, or how do we be with these questions? And that's not a quick process. Mm-hmm. It's getting ahead of our own trauma narratives around sexuality is not a quick process. It's not taking a pill. It's not a class. Mm-hmm. Like, there is a very, very slow, intentional process of building community and being in trust and saying, like, does this person really want to know me? Can this group of people really sit with me and see these parts of me that I'm too scared to even look at myself? Mm-hmm. So in that unfair question, I'm also in the sense of like, oh, and what's the container like to do that? Mm-hmm. And how do we hold each other as a community to do that? Mm-hmm. Community of white folks who come together, a mixed race community who does that, communities of folks of color, and specifically Black folks, and just the way that holistic resistance really intentionally creates space, like a new level of curation of spaces for safety, for braveness, for the possibility of getting deeper in this work and letting it sink in deeper and deeper.
Mm-hmm. Mm. I so appreciate the piece you said about slowing it down and how you kind of just expanded on the value of slowing down, and not to be too redundant here, but just to name how important it is to note that methodology has been the game changer. For me, early on into this work, it was to build relationships. I wrote the 400 cross-line appropriate questions to hopefully find a lifelong partner. And that in that process, I expanded to every part of my life, realizing I didn't know anyone in my life. But what I didn't learn until about 5 to 10 years later was the power of questions alone aren't really useful. But what's useful, and there's many things that attach this, but one of the things that I found to be critical, it turned the corner for me, and questions being more shock value and maybe productive at the end to being life transformative and being lifelong relationships, was my ability to slow down what was happening. And I did have some advantage of that as a photographer and filmmaker, and particularly the photography part, because photography is really about freezing moments in an experience. It could be a modeling shoot or a journalistic experience where you're out there in the field shooting something that's happening. It's really about taking a second of a moment and then kind of taking it into your computer nowadays and looking at it and examining it and noticing that. And so I say that because when I think of slowing it down, usually when one of these questions comes up, an unfair question, like you said before, like what is your ideal Black person? And that has many layers to that question. There's a way you want to like rush past it or get really quick, but typically if I had like a monitor on every one of my workshops heart, I'm sure by the time it exits my mouth, we see heart rates going up and a little bit more of like, how can I get through this? And what actually is needed is a deep slowdown, really taking the time to track your body, track how you're processing. And that feels almost excruciatingly uncomfortable. But to me, I found that's where all the nectar and wisdom is in the slowdown, taking the time, breaking it down, even saying it slower again. Like even just like in your voice, even saying it slower can help your body go, oh, I can be with this particular question or particular feeling. So then you mentioned too, like in the body, how might the body express a process? And one thing I'll just land here at the end here of this thought around slowing things down is most revolutions and most shifts that feel quick all happen slowly, right? And for me, I sit with that because I'm the first one that wants to solve things quickly and swiftly. But I realize that it's the slow building of the container that makes the swift actions very effective, strategic, and long lasting. And I want to be vague in that, but we think about I don't know how many parents that will tell you, when I had a kid, it took forever. And then sometimes it's like super fast all at the same time. Like it was just yesterday they were in my arms and now they're going to college. It's like whiplash at the same time. There was this mini grinding, slow increment, building, failing, succeeding, failing, almost succeeding, think you succeed. And then all of a sudden we get here and we're like, oh, they're only 2 years old. Like, oh, like when is we get to like, when can they talk to me and have a whole conversation? Like, I mean, parents like, it was hard until they started talking. Now they're talking like, oh, I can talk to them. And some parents, never get the chance to really talk to their children because their disability or whatever it is, or their ability to talk. So the marathon is different for all. But I say that because my mother raised 5 of us. There are people looking at her and be like, oh, that must be easy and fast. And she breaks down how about this one child. You realize it was a very slow process to assemble each child and build a community around them. And so for us, I think I want to be realistic about, in some ways, slowing things down is like just putting on glasses to see clearly for the first time for me when it comes to these questions. And I think when you talk about topics like race, sexuality, you want to be seen as clearly as possible. And how to get there, I think, is slowing it down, which has a variety of meanings, but mostly is the meaning to see, take the time to digest and to absorb. And that's what I think has changed the game for us in holistic resistance when it comes to how we are able to hold people. People think we're joking when I say it. It's a lifetime reach. Right. That's nice. That's a nice phrase. Nice phrase. But in order for us to shift this, we realize it's going to be a lifetime. So that's why we know our lifetime's not near enough, because we're slowing it down enough and realize that we're just a little piece in this whole journey. We want to make sure we do be as effective as possible in that little piece. So, yeah.
And there's a way I've so appreciated that in even receiving these jarring questions, wonderful, important, uncomfortable questions where you say, well, I'll be asking these questions for the next 5 years, the next 10 years. Yeah. And so for me, that so helped me to know I didn't need to get it right. Yeah. Oh, what am I moving through? What giggle, what tension am I moving through in this question today? And then getting to ponder either the same question or just the same topic or this particular nature of being in holistic resistance today and tomorrow and the next day and the day after that, that we don't have to solve anything right now, either in ourselves or as a growing community.
That's so true. That's well said. I'm curious, Grace, because you have questions for me, but I want to sneak one in for you. I'm curious about a statement I was saying earlier in this call about the impossible used to make me walk away from situations, but now I try to angle about how I can hit that, whatever barrier is, at an angle that makes it possible. And I think one of the things that your work from outside looking in, especially around sexuality, is it takes these ideas of impossibilities, specifically around like race. How it's impossible, Grace, for you to hold this complexity with your positionality or your identity. I'm curious how you hold these topics around sexuality that from the outside looking in might feel impossible. For example, reaching for another Black male around his touch needs, or bringing up a topic about this topic to another white person that doesn't quite have the any awareness around that there's intentional undertouched Black men to weaponize against white women to perpetuate a narrative that Black men are violent and can't control their sexuality. That narrative is not by a coincidence or accident. That narrative is strategically put together to hurt and harm Black men and white women and everybody.
I should time myself on this question because I think I could go for a long time. It's a great question. So I'll set 3 minutes here. But there's 2 aspects of this that come up for me as I hear you ask this question about taking on the impossible around sexuality and around just the complexity of that narrative that you just, very quickly in 10 seconds, we're like, oh, this curated narrative around the Black body and chronically undertouched men and how that's connected to lynchings and how do I hold that as a white person? And like, oh, you mean that 5 years of work to detangle that I feel like I've been explicitly working with you on the last 2.5 years. And before that was explicitly working with myself the last 10 years. And for me, part of it is seeing that, as you say, the lifetime reach within myself. Like I couldn't I couldn't have held the possibility of seeing the chronic undertouch needs of Black men and how that leads to mass incarceration, just as one particular example of harm. If I wasn't able to slow down, oh, what are my own touch needs? What's it like for me to be in relationship with a Black man around touch? Whether that's intimate, whether that's professional, whether that's platonic, whether that's in a session with you. And so I think of the first chronically undertouched deep dive we held it at my center at SEC in Seattle. And I was reaching for folks to invite them to this. And this is a sex positive, touch positive community, white controlled community, spiritual community in Seattle. And what I got back from folks that was quite defensive and offended. It was like, from white folks specifically, well, I know Black people. I don't need to sit down and talk about why Black people need touch. Mm-hmm. And it was just this sense of like massively closing up and feeling offended. Mm-hmm. And then as I've gotten to reach for that particular deep dive and the chronic overtouch deep dive around Black women, that's coming up in a couple of weeks, and is back to the slowing down, really, like how I can slow down the levels of discomfort that I understand specifically with specific people as I talk about this. It's one thing to have a general statement about like, what is it like to support the chronic undertouch needs of young Black men in America? Okay, that's a big general statement. And then when I reach for someone specifically, my mom, for example, a 69-year-old white woman raised in the Northwest, or other folks in my life, folks who are, my age, like older millennials, well-educated, middle class, like to reach through their trauma stories and through their narratives about sexuality and through their narratives around racism and through their places that they get defensive and hold shame in the intersection of these topics specifically, and be willing to listen and to reframe and to get curious and not be in a hurry as to like, how do we get to the point where somebody says, yes, I can hold all of this? Like, that's not really the question. It's what's available now that we could talk about. And then how do we leave that and then walk back to this next conversation? Because there's ways that I can do that with my friends. There's ways I can do that with my family. There's ways I can do that professionally. There's ways I can do that as a community director. And it all comes back to, what am I willing to look at in myself? So in my own positionality as a white person, in my own positionality raised as a female, being willing to go past my own defensiveness and my own trauma stories and extend, I notice with my hands, I just open my hands up, like extend the possibility to be open with your story, to be open with the story of young Black men, to be open with the story of queer Black female friends, and not close down in myself around that. And as we always talk about, this intersection of sexuality and racism is like the two biggest untouchables in American culture. It is like the two things that make people shut down the quickest. It is the two things we have been trained not to see and not to talk about. We can put money in there too as the other category. I'll pause there. That was over my time.
You nailed it, and I think you nailed the buckets that need to be like investigated, and as much as they're intertwined, there's a way. I appreciate that at the end you just dropped in the capitalism piece, because when you look at the slave trade and they're saying, well, they were farming cotton. I was reading this on the Gold Coast book. I can't remember the name. Gold Coast in the title. They said, but the most valuable thing was the actual slaves on site. Like, if you look at the whole summation of the whole entire property, and you sold all the land, and the most capital was the slaves. That was the money, the tender that they traded and moved around money with. And when I say that, it's not even an intersection at that point, when the actual Black bodies is the tender, is the investment. I think there's a story in California about some folks that were sold to pay for a part of a university, and they're getting some reparation impact. And I just heard it literally in the peripheral of the news, so I have to actually find out all the details. But it's a situation where, from what I understand, I'm gonna get more details on this in a minute, because I'm literally, my mom told me about it. I heard it in the news, like saying they did a story on it in this last week. From what I understand, someone was sold during the period of time of slavery, and that money was used to build a portion of the university, and there was some lineage documentation of that, and people that are still living are saying, hey, I would like reparations for that, because technically my DNA funded the section of this part in California, and it says like the court allowed some kind of reparations to start taking place. But I name that because that little experience is important to track, because that's America. I'm not trying to erase all the Native folks and other BIPOC folks that have been exploited, but there's a way in which the tender in which the money was exchanged and the economy was supported, Black bodies was a center point on this continent. And so I say that because sexuality and finances weren't really even that far apart. They were literally embedded and woven together, and they have this illusion that they've kind of separated themselves. And we have like capitalism over here, we have oppression over here, and we got sex over here. But we know that they really are not that separate at all. They're still very much intertwined. And I think for us, that's why we are kind of just like peeling back these layers. I just appreciate you kind of naming those nuances. And I also want to go back to earlier about, very sexual positive environment, feeling offended because we're talking about this it's almost like talking to a mathematician about 2 + 2 basic math. It's like touch is one. If you're in the tantra or that place, but I've gone so into touch, like I know it in the pores of my body, spiritually, when I die, when I'm alive. Like, how dare we talk about something so basic? I don't even learn about that. And when we slow it down, no pun intended here, but we slow it down, we realize there's actually a lot to notice, especially in a white controlled container, which I would say America is. And there's places that are more hyper white than others, but in the Northwest, it's a particularly beautiful white container. I mean, it's so nice that I walk in there and go, this is nice. Like I can really waddle in that just beautiful nest that's been created in the north part of the United States. It feels very different than like Los Angeles and LA. It's a different kind of white privilege that's utilized there than the Northwest. It's like a lot of nature-based, and it feels a little more holier in some ways, but it's just as bloody as the ones in here. LA is like bling bling, got the Mercedes, and the minute everyone show how much money they got. Northwest like, no, I care about this tree more than the Black person over there. I just want to sit here and ignore this Black person, but we're gonna fight for this tree here. And I care for that tree, but I also track how we can bypass caring for human beings too, because we're so committed to that tree. And I really see that kind of a difference. But go back to my main point of folks feeling defensive, like how dare you? Yeah, from what I heard you share, like there's nothing there to learn. I don't need to sit in a workshop. That's so important. And yet I feel like when we look at the framing and the holding of Black bodies particularly, when I see people collapse or get overwhelmed with different Black trauma stories, or get surprised by a trauma story that pops up they never saw it coming, it's oftentimes because they don't respect or acknowledge the magnitude of the trauma story of being chronically undertouched. And so for me, I was talking to a woman in the same culture of Tantra and other sexual positive communities, and she's like, I know this Black man, he gets all kind of girls. Like, he has all kind of girlfriends. I don't think he has a touch problem. I was like, one of the first signs of someone that's undertouched is that they're just like hypersexualizing everything around them, because like, my sexual body can get me this much. That's just how much touch can I get, right? And I'm not saying that just because they have a lot of partners that they can't receive touch, but what I'm saying is that oftentimes when I experience Black men, they go, I have sexual partners all around me. I've been married for X amount of years, and I love my partner, and I am undertouched. And it's not because of lack of touch that partner is given, but a lack of knowledge of the vast of touch they need, right? And healing that's needed. And so the only touch they typically receive is sexual touch, which is wonderful, acceptable, and needed. But there's like, if you talk about flavors, it's like, all I know is sugar sweet. That's all the flavors I know. It's like, there's so many other flavors and nuances of food other than sugar sweet, right? And so for me, I look at touch the same way. It's like, if your only touch for a Black male is framed under even among sexuality, a small slice of sexuality, and defined by mainstream culture, you're gonna be malnourished, The soil in which your touch needs are grown out of does not have enough nutrients to support your spirit. But if we actually acknowledge what's happening, that's what we're trying to do with this workshop, is acknowledge that the very soil in which we grew out our touch plan is not efficient. So we're inviting us to slow down and go back into that and assess the source of what framed our touch plan, historically and presently. Then we can birth out the idea of, oh, slavery has a big impact. Racism has a big impact. Capitalism has a big impact. Working in 9 to 5, I remember I'll close with this idea. I was listening to a podcast, but I was talking to them, but to be wilders, and they were just tracking how hard hunter-gatherers actually worked. And there's this narrative that they slaved away, lack of better terms. It's like they worked every day just to get enough things to make it. And they're not doing the math. They only hunted like a couple hours a week in most tropical environments, and they would sleep for a bunch of time. They would socialize for a bunch of time. Their actual working hours would make any red-blooded American jealous about actually how much time they spend stressing out about their resources and retirement and all that resource gathering. They were very much at ease before climate change and oppression became to sort of rip and strip their soils and their resources. And I track that because for me, I track, sometimes we feel we are advancing and we're actually going backwards and not realizing it, because of very much the foundations of capitalism is about to surprise us about tracking our own bodies, how much time we actually work, and what does rest really look like. And so for me, a person that works extremely hard in a variety of different containers, I'm constantly tracking, how much am I letting capitalism take away the nourishment of rest, the nourishment of slowing down? And I have the privilege of my work being a big part of me slowing down, and a big part of me taking in rest in ways that I've never had any other job I've ever worked. But that being said, that's one of the things I'm invited to examine. Is not just, let's talk about touch. Let's talk about the origin story of touch, particularly in America, and who is feeding the nourishment of that narrative. And why is it when I Google 3 Black men, right? 3 Black men cuddling, touching thoughtfully, maybe they're grounded to the earth, like sitting on the earth or next to the earth or next in a nature environment. I'm like, man, I cannot find that anywhere hardly. Then I type 2 Black men having sex with 2 thin body white women, and they're hyper muscly. I'll get 10,000 videos, 1,000 comments, and a whole infrastructure to support that narrative. So it's quite clear when they say, well, what wolf are you feeding? Well, obviously we're feeding the wolf that is this is tearing down the entire structure of what it means to be human as a Black male and a white woman in that narrative. And I don't say that to be anti-pornographic, but realizing that the porn structure in which oftentimes it's consumed is based on trauma stories that have not been examined. And I think I always have to examine them just a little more and go, what's here? I'm not saying this is bad or good, but what's happening? And there's a way that we can build more context to it and be a little more conscious about it. The act itself is not violent, but what it teaches, without a container, a scaffolding of wisdom around it, it becomes a little more weaponized or easily weaponized to perpetuate a harm narrative of, consent culture becomes a strange behavior to someone's under touch. It's like, why are you talking about consent? I'm starving. I don't talk about consent. I'm starving. That's a trauma story. So consent is really important, and consent can really settle in when we have that trauma story addressed, as opposed to just saying consent, consent, consent. You can say that as loud as you want, but the trauma story will pass that up or try and find a way around it if we don't heal the trauma story that's causing the violations to continue to happen over and over. So that's some of the pieces that came up about slowing down the touch plan. The touch plan of white controlled spaces really tracking Black bodies. So glad you recorded this.
Oof. Yeah. And there's just one piece I want to pick out, see if I can do this in a minute and a half left, which is, again, that response of how to invite white people into this work, right? Because that is one of my big roles, how to invite white people into this work. And one of the things that I hear you address so often is the systemic nature. And we are living in a culture right now where we can hear those words and go, oh, right, it's not just them, it's not just me. And there's this psychological approach we've had for the last 100 years coming out of Europe, led by white men, which is entirely individualistic. So we're talking about secure attachment needs. We're talking about narcissistic personalities. We're talking about sociopathy. We're talking about just these very individual, what's wrong with me? And it came from my parents, and here's this just very specific one-off. And what the conversation that you are in and that we are in and that so many people in the world are in right now, I mean, look at Resmaa Medicum's work, look at Adrienne Maree Brown, who you referenced earlier, is around actually what's happening collectively that we're not willing to see because it's been curated for us. So as a white person, I have been trained to see the individual. That's where the culture has taught me to look. Mm-hmm. My individual, other people's individual. Because that's how we divide. That's how we stay separate. That's how we stay small. We can look at the capitalistic purview of that. But what we're talking about, what you're talking about, is actually seeing how there's a whole ocean of this. And we have all been impacted by the systemic violence of the curation of sexuality, the systemic violence of the curation of capitalism, and how we can't separate that from, yes, this is happening to me, but how do I take that a little bit less personally when I realize I'm also impacted by the curation, the collective, the systemic? And I know for white folks, there's a lot of defensiveness that comes up because the first question is like, yeah, but what about me? Exactly. And that's where I've been taught to look. So in this work, like lowering the guards on what's everywhere and how can I see that and still honor myself? Because I'm not actually taking myself out of this equation. I get to show up more when I acknowledge the collective. But that can be a really new experience if you've only been taught to hyper-individualize.
Now the grace. So good to hear your wisdom on that. You got that in there.